Parsha. So this week's Parsha is Parshas Vayikra. It begins on page 545 in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash. Once again, this is Parshas Vayikra. And it begins, he called to Moshe and Hashem spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man among you brings an offering to Hashem from animals, from the cattle, or from the flock, shall you bring your offering. And then the rest of the Parsha is dedicated, this week's Parsha and really next week's Parsha is dedicated towards what the offerings are and how exactly they're brought. But the way the verse starts is interesting. That first of all, it says, he called to Moshe. This is the beginning of the book, but it starts with a pronoun, not and Hashem called to Moshe. It's he called to Moshe, and Hashem spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So it's an interesting, we usually don't start a book with the pronoun. It would usually start, and Hashem called to Moshe and spoke to him. And the Ramban says that this is really a continuation of the end of Pekudei. And that is that the book of Shemos, specifically Pekudei, ends that Moshe could not enter the tent of meeting. If you go back to page 541, it said the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of Hashem filled the tabernacle, and Moshe could not enter the tent of meeting for the cloud rested upon it. And the glory of Hashem filled the tabernacle. And that's the continuation. And he called to Moshe, meaning Moshe could not enter because the cloud covered the tabernacle, showing that the divine presence was there. But then he called to Moshe that Hashem invited him in, and once he was invited in, he could come into the tabernacle. Okay, another thing here is that you see in the Hebrew, the first word, Vayikra, that the Aleph in Vayikra, the letter is smaller than the rest of the word. What's that? Oh, yeah, and I haven't seen it.
So, Hashem's voice.
Yeah. He's going on. Yeah. Right. So that's one approach. There are a number of approaches in the Midrashim and the commentaries. I'll take another one since the Rabbi already taught one. And that is that it's small to if it's almost like to telling you that you could read the word also without the aleph. And the word without the aleph, Vayikra, would become Vayikar. And that's the way that the Torah describes Hashem speaking to Bilam. That when Bilam had his prophecy, it says Vayikar, not Vayikra, and he called, but Vayikar, which literally would mean, and he happened upon him. That Vayikar makes it sound like it's like a chance meeting, not that he actually called to him, which is a very intentional form of meeting. Is you call to someone, that means you're intending to meet with them, and he happened upon him means that he just happened to encounter him. And our sages say it's because Moshe was so humble that he didn't want it to say that he called to him, which is an expression of importance, that God called to him. But I saw the Klei Yakar describes this and interprets this in that the Torah is actually equating Moshe to Bilam in a certain way. And that is that why did Bilam have prophecy? Our sages say that he wasn't deserving of the prophecy. He wasn't a person who prophecy is a natural occurrence based on his behavior and based on his spiritual connection, and the way he lived a spiritual life. That's not why he had prophecy, and really he wasn't deserving of it. He had prophecy in order that the nations of the world wouldn't have a claim that if they had a prophet like Moshe, so they would have been righteous and wouldn't have persecuted us, etc. So therefore, but they were given a prophet, and that prophet was Bilam. But just as an individual, he really wasn't deserving and prepared for the prophecy that he had. And the Torah is telling us that in a sense that Moshe is similar to that. In that, the sages say that Moshe had prophecy in a way that no one else in history had prophecy. Is that while everyone else, every prophet, they had a dream or a vision that was like in riddles that had to be interpreted and had to be understood because they had a vision that was just like almost metaphorical, that had to be looked at and understood. What does this mean? And we see for example, in Zechariah, with the prophet Zechariah, where the angel asked him, he had a vision, the angel asked him, what does it mean? And he said, I don't know. And the angel had to explain to him what the meaning of this prophecy was. Whereas Moshe, the Torah says that his prophecies were like one person talking to another. Very clear. He was told what the message was. And Hashem spoke to him, and it was understood just like one person talking to another. And no human being is deserving of that or prepared to that. Even Moshe. Moshe might have been deserving of the highest level of prophecy, but he wasn't as prepared for that. And the reason why he did get that prophecy is, as the verse continues, that and Hashem spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying that word lamor means speak to the children of Israel and say to them. The reason why he had this level of prophecy was because the Jewish people needed a prophet on that level. And because he was the one who brought the Torah to the Jewish people, so there had to be a clear, unquestionable source for the Torah. So it wasn't because he was personally deserving, or deserving might be the wrong word. It wasn't because Moshe was personally on a spiritual level to receive the prophecy that he had. He wasn't. He was the most prepared of any human being, but nobody was prepared for that. But he did get that level of prophecy because of in order to communicate with the will of Hashem to the Jewish people. So that's why it puts the aleph small to say that in one way, in that sense, he was similar to Bilam, that he received prophecy in a way that he really wasn't deserving. So that level of prophecy that Moshe had was really Vayikra, that he happened upon him, not that he was prepared for that level of prophecy. And the Klei said that's also why we find when the Jewish people sinned with the golden calf, Hashem said to him, Lech Reid, go and descend. So on a surface level, that means like go down the mountain to confront the Jewish people for their sin. But on another level, it means that you need to go descend, meaning from the level of prophecy that you have right now, you're losing some level of that. There's going to be a descent because Moshe's prophecy came as a function, as a messenger to the Jewish people. So when the Jewish people were not deserving of that, so Moshe lost the level of his prophecy until later the Torah says that he again was granted that level of prophecy when they repented.
One thing that you just said.
Yeah.
Jews were blamed for the golden calf.
Yeah.
Jews didn't do the golden calf. It was the Egyptians that came with it.
But they were
that initiated it.
That's true. They initiated it, but they at some level they were blamed for it for having allowed it to happen. Meaning that if they would have stood up in a strong way, they could have prevented it from happening, and they didn't. So they were blamed to a large extent that the luchos, the tablets, were destroyed, because once again we're talking about at the level that they had achieved, that was considered a tremendous sin, even though they weren't the ones who initiated it. You're right. Okay, so now, what are these offerings? So as we said in verse 2, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man among you brings an offering to Hashem from animals, from the cattle, or from the flock, you shall bring your offering. So that's the three kinds of animals an offering could be brought from. This is besides birds, but the three kinds of animals, meaning like land animals as opposed to birds, are from the cattle or from the flock. That is, the cattle are cows, and flock are sheep and goats, or sheep and goats, I guess, would be the proper way of saying that. And our sages say that this is a big kindness for Hashem, from Hashem, because those are the most available of all kosher animals. They're domesticated animals. He could have said, bring it from the deer or from antelope, which is much more difficult to attain, but they're readily available animals. And also the commentaries say that that we find that our patriarchs, each of our patriarchs are associated with one of these animals. And that is that Abraham, it says that when the angels came to visit them, so he slaughtered bulls for the angels, and with Yitzchak, so what is it with Yitzchak? Oh yeah, so when Yitzchak was bound as an offering to Hashem, so it says in his place was brought a ram that had its horns are caught in the thicket, and the ram is the male sheep. And Yaakov, it says that when he got the blessings from his father from Yitzchak, so he brought him two goats as food for the as food for the blessing. So he's associated with the goats. What's that? Yes, and he took the hair from his goats and put them on him to deceive Yitzchak. So each of these animals is associated with one of our patriarchs. So the first time of offering described here in verse 3, if one's offering is an elevation offering from the cattle, it should offer an unblemished male, that the elevation offerings are always male, and he brings it voluntarily before Hashem. In verse 547, it says, in verse 4, sorry, page 547, verse 4, it says, he shall lean his hands upon the head of the elevation offering, and it should become acceptable for him to atone for him. So we're saying to say, what's the atonement of the elevation offering? We know like sin offerings is naturally an atonement, but the elevation offering, we said, is brought voluntarily. What's the atonement there? And I say to say that a person would bring it as an atonement for sinful thoughts. That whereas the sin offering and the asham, the guilt offering, was brought for sinful actions, the olah, the burnt offering, was brought for sinful thoughts. And he slaughters it. They would bring the blood and throw it on the altar at the entrance of the tent of meeting. This is the altar in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. In verse 6, he shall skin the elevation offering and cut it into pieces. In verse 7, the sons of Aaron the Kohanim place the fire, arrange the wood, and they shall arrange the pieces, the heads, the fats of the wood that is on the altar, that is the fire that is on the altar. And he shall wash its innards and its feet with water, and the Kohen shall cause it all to go up and smoke on the altar, an elevation offering, a fire offering, a satisfying aroma to Hashem. So the commentaries point out, the Medrash points out, that it says in verse 5, he shall slaughter the bull. Then it says the sons of Aaron the Kohanim shall bring the blood. Then in verse 6, he shall skin the offering and cut it into pieces. And then in verse 7, the sons of Aaron the Kohanim shall place the fire in the altar. So you see like it's switching back and forth between he and the sons of Aaron the Kohanim. And that's because those things that it says he shall do are kosher even if a non-Kohen does it. An Israelite is kosher to do it. So an Israelite is allowed to do the slaughtering of the animal and the skinning and butchering of the animal. So it says that he shall slaughter it. The slaughtering could be done by a non-Kohen. And in verse, where is it again? In verse 6, he shall skin the elevation offering and cut it into pieces. That could also be done by a non-Kohen, but every other part has to be done by the Kohanim. So the cashing of the blood, the sprinkling on the altar, and the bringing the pieces to the altar had to be done by the Kohanim.
For the slaughtering of the animal, it had to be done by a Jew.
A Jew, but not necessarily a Kohen. That's correct.
I said it was
Okay, yes.
to be done by a Jew.
Yes.
So slaughterhouses, the packing houses.
Right.
All the guys who do the killing
Right.
are all Jewish.
Yes. So I was actually by a shrita, by a slaughtering. The shochet just passed away recently. It should be an aliyah for his neshama. But so I was by a slaughtering in St. Louis. It was probably right before Pesach. It was before Yantif, and he was slaughtering cows. And that's the way they did the shochet. They had the shochet, the slaughterer. They had the guy from the mashgiach who certified it as kosher, and they had the USDA guy who certified it as safe, and they had and then the workers were non-Jews, meaning the USDA guy and the workers. Once the slaughtering was done, so then the workers would skin it and cut it in half, basically cut it into sides. And they were non-Jews. But yeah, the slaughtering had to be done by a Jew, even when we're not talking about a carbon and offering, even if we're talking about just meat for secular consumption.
Kosher thing, it
Yeah.
can be done by anybody.
Right.
And I watched a woman who
Yeah.
was from Germany, big heavy set gal.
Yeah.
She did the killing,
Mm-hmm.
then she pulled out a jug.
Yeah.
Caught the blood, some of the blood coming out,
Yeah.
and started drinking.
Yeah. So it's interesting with Shrita, though, we'll see later in the Torah, is that there's actually some mitzvahs that we do with the blood, that is with a non-domesticated animal, species of animal. So pretty much any like mammal that's kosher besides a cow, sheep, or goat, so like deer or antelope. There's and with birds, when birds are, so like chickens, so when they're shechted, there's a mitzvah to cover the blood. So we would actually have to have like a pile of sand. You would slaughter them over the sand and then cover it with sand. But okay. So let's continue here. And then it describes if it's a sheep, it's a similar process. And so where are we? Oh, so that was if it's a from the cattle. So then and it's a bull because it's male. And then in verse 10, if one's offering is from the flock, from the sheep, or from the goat, so that's a ram or a male goat, it's similar process. And then in verse 14 on page 549, we have if one's offering to Hashem is an elevation offering of fowl, the bird, he shall bring his offering from turtle doves or from young doves. So there could be two types of birds are kosher. They're turtle doves, and that's an adult um, turtle dove or a young, when it's a regular dove, it's specifically a young dove. And the Medrash says this is because that turtle doves are loyal to their mates. So we do a turtle dove, they're monogamous or whatever the word is, I think. But young with doves, with regular doves, they're very aggressive with their loyalty to their mate, which causes they're very very jealous, and there's a lot of violence in there, and they're defending their territory. So we only eat. So we could only bring. You could eat any of them, but you could only bring a young dove as an offering, not an older dove, because that's when they get aggressive. Okay. And so the process for a bird in verse 15, the Kohen shall bring it to the altar, nip its head. So instead of slaughtering it, he actually uses his fingernail and goes through its neck from the back of the neck and cause it to go up and smoke on the altar, having pressed out its blood on the altar wall. He shall remove its crop with his feathers. I say he removes the crop because the birds, they don't stay on the land of their owner. You keep them in a dove coop, but they go out and forage on their own, and they'll eat grain from other people. They'll eat food from other people's fields, so it's considered stolen. So we remove the crop with the food that's in it and throw that out. He throws it near the altar to the east, to the place of the ashes, and then he shall split it with its feathers. He need not sever it. The Kohen shall cause it to go up in the smoke on the altar. On the wood that is on the fire is an elevation offering, a fire offering, a satisfying aroma to Hashem. So here it says that he throws it near the altar and he split it with its feathers and caused it to go up in smoke. That means that he's throwing the bird with the feathers, with the wings still attached, onto the fire. So the Rashi says that feathers don't smell good when they're burning. It's very unpleasant thing to smell burning feathers. So why would they not remove the feathers before putting it on the altar? I say it's because who's bringing a bird as a burnt offering? It would generally be a poor person. Someone who can't afford a sheep or a goat would be the ones bringing a bird as an offering. And therefore, to remove the feathers significantly makes it significantly smaller, and it looks like a little pitiful little offering. So the mitzvah is that we should we should put it even with the feathers in order to have that the offering of a poor person is that the whole thing should be burnt on the altar. Right. Okay, so then we have a meal offering in chapter 2, page 549, chapter 2. When a person offers a meal offering to Hashem, his offering shall be fine flour. He shall pour oil upon it and put frankincense upon it. He shall bring it to the sons of Aaron, the Kohanim, one of whom shall scoop his 3 fingers full from it, from its fine flour and from its oil, as well as its frankincense, and the Kohen shall cause its memorial portion to go up and smoke upon the altar. A fire offering, a satisfying aroma to Hashem. This is on page 551. The remnants of the meal offering is for Aaron and his sons, most holy from the fire offerings of Hashem. So now dealing with the meal offering, so it says they would mix the flour with the oil and put frankincense on and smear oil on top. Take a handful, which is 3 fingers full, so that he would dip in his 3 fingers like this, scrape off the sides, just that amount. The amount that fits in these 3 fingers and his palm would be burnt on the altar, and the rest was eaten by the Kohanim. So this is if it's just flour and oil. But there are some other kinds, and there's also an oven baked offering when they would use, again, that's fine flour and oil, but it would be baked in an oven. There's a Where are you? In verse 4, when you offer a meal offering that's baked in an oven, it should be fine flour, unleavened loaves mixed with oil, or unleavened wafers smeared with oil. That's like a thicker loaf or a thinner loaf, or like almost like a pita or a like real thick loaf. And in verse 5, if your offering is a meal offering on the pan, so there's a one that's fried in a pan, and again they would break it into pieces in verse 6, pour oil, and then take that handful. Or in verse 7, there's a deep pan offering. It's like a deep dish pizza kind of, that it's fried but in a deep pan, so it's much thicker. But all of these are, let's see, in verse 11, any meal offering that you offer to Hashem shall not be prepared leavened, but you shall not cause to go up and smoke from any leavening or fruit honey as an offering to Hashem. So all of these, even though it's baked in a thicker loaf or a thin loaf or a thick frying pan or a thin wafer on a frying pan, but it was never chametz. It was always it always has to be unleavened. And also it says that you can't add fruit honey to the offerings. And our sages, or I think Rabbi Sternbach explains what's wrong with adding honey to the offerings. You would think that would make it even more pleasant if you put honey in this meal offering. And he says it's a message that people sometimes feel a need to beautify the mitzvahs outside the bounds of what the Torah allows. For example, if a person might feel a need to put up a beautiful statue in the shul, as to beautify the shul, and it might be really beautiful. You might have like Michelangelo, whatever, a statue, but if it's against the Torah, it's, in spite of the fact that it might feel like beautifying the mitzvah, it's outside the bounds of the Torah, and that's what it's saying. No honey added to the mincha, to the meal offering, that we have to do it within the bounds of the Torah. Okay, and in verse 13 on page 553, another clause to it is that you shall salt your every meal offering with salt. You may not discontinue the salt of your God's covenant from upon your meal offering. On your every offering shall you offer salt. So there's also a mitzvah to add salt to every offering, not just every meal offering, but every offering has to have salt and it has to be salted. And Rav Hirsch explains this idea of salting is that he's saying salt is something that we use to prevent spoilage and we use to prevent growth. That is that you would salt meat or you would salt meat to prevent it from spoiling. But it used to be that when an army would conquer a city, if they wanted to really teach them a lesson, they call it salt the earth. That they would salt the earth around the city to stop it from producing, to stop it from growing. And it's because that salt, he says that, what's that? Right, absorbs all the moisture, and yeah. So he says that salt represents being static, not changing. That it stops spoilage and it stops growth. It stops change. And he says that represents the Torah. And that the Torah has to be consistent throughout the generations. And we could understand how the Torah teaches us to act and to live in different circumstances, but the Torah itself doesn't change. And that has to be along with our service of Hashem, we need the Torah as well to guide us in serving Hashem. And there's another medrash that says that that in the second day of creation, it says that Hashem split the upper waters and the lower waters. And there's a spiritual aspect to that, where the upper waters are in like the spiritual world, and there's the physical waters. And it says that the waters that were put in the physical world were bothered, that now they were taken away from the spiritual. So they were given a covenant. It says that in verse 13 that you may not discontinue the salt of your God's covenant. What's this covenant? That Hashem made a covenant with the lower waters that they would be used as offerings. And that is that we use salt, which is from the sea, and we use salt with every offering, and we bring water as an offering on Sukkot. And that's this covenant of Hashem's salt. Okay. So now in chapter 3, on page 553, we have the peace offering. If his offering is a peace offering, he offers it from the cattle, whether male or female, unblemished. And in verse 2, he shall lean his head upon the head of his offering, slaughter at the entrance of the tents of meeting. And the peace offering, parts of it are burnt on the altar, as it says in verse 3. He shall offer as a fire offering to Hashem the fat that covers the innards, and all the fat that is upon the innards, and the 2 kidneys with the fat that is upon them, that is upon the flanks. And he shall remove the diaphragm with the liver with the kidneys, and all these parts are offered on the altar. We'll see in next week's Parsha that also the chest and the right forearm, the shuk, and the right leg were given to the Kohen, to the Kohanim, and the rest of it was eaten by the owners or whoever would eat with him in a limited amount of time in Yerushalayim or around the Mishkan. Okay, then in verse chapter 4, we have the sin offering. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel." This is the bottom of 555, verse chapter 4. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, when a person will sin unintentionally from among all the commandments of Hashem that may not be done, and he commits one of them." And our sages say that a sin offering was brought specifically in the cases of a sin that would carry a penalty of kares. That's if it would have been done intentionally, it would carry a penalty of kares, which is being cut off from the Jewish people, and it was done or a death sentence or a capital punishment, and it was done unintentionally. So, but first, before describing of an individual, it brings a few special cases of sin offerings. And the first one on page 557, verse 3, if the anointed Kohen will sin, bringing guilt upon the people for a sin that he committed. That's if the Kohen Gadol, the anointed Kohen, would do a sin, and others follow him with that sin. So he shall offer a young bull unblemished to Hashem as a sin offering, and the process of this was very different than the other offerings. It says that in verse 6, the Kohen shall dip his forefingers into the blood. He shall sprinkle some of the blood 7 times before Hashem towards the curtain of the holy. He would sprinkle the blood on the curtain that separates the sanctuary from the Holy of Holies. And the Kohen shall put some of the blood on the horns of the altar where incense is caused to go up and spoke before Hashem. Whereas most offerings, the blood was put on the outer altar. This was put on the inner altar, the altar that was inside the sanctuary. And some of the fats and innards, again, were burnt on the altar, at the outside altar. And then in verse 11, but the hide of the bull and its flesh with its head, with its feet and its innards and its waist, the entire bull shall be removed to the outside of the camp to a pure place to which ashes is poured, and he shall burn it in wood and fire, and the place where the ashes is poured shall it be burnt. So it wasn't eaten by the Kohanim like a normal sin offering was done. It wasn't burnt on the altar like a burnt offering. This sin offering was a special case, and it was brought to outside of the camp and was burnt there outside. Then we have on page 559, verse 13, another special case of a sin offering, and that's if the entire assembly of Israel shall err, and a matter becomes obscured from the eyes of the congregation, and they commit one from among all the commandments of Hashem that may not be done, and they become guilty. This is when the high court, the Sanhedrin, the high court, makes a mistaken decision to permit something that's forbidden by the Torah, and a majority of the people follow that decision. So in that case, that's another special case where, in verse 14, the congregation shall offer a young bull as a sin offering, and in verse 15, the elders of the assembly shall lean their heads, and they would bring it in a similar fashion that the previous bull was brought. That is that the blood would be sprinkled on the altar that's towards the curtain that separates between the Holy and the Holy of Holies. So some of the blood is sprinkled on the inner altar where the incense is burnt. Some of the fats and the innards are burnt on the outer altar, and the rest of it is burnt outside the camp again. Then in verse 22, still on page 559, we have another special case of sin offering, and that is the he-goat of a ruler. It says, when the ruler sins and commits one from among all the commandments of Hashem that may not be done unintentionally, becomes guilty, and it gives the description of what he does. And the commentaries comment that you notice that in the verse 3 on page 557, the first special case, it says, if the anointed Kohen will sin. The Hebrew is im, if. Again on page 559, verse 13, another special case, if the entire assembly. The Hebrew, again, ve'im, and if. Whereas, now when the ruler sins, verse 22, it says when the ruler sins, not if. The Hebrew is asher nasi yachta. That, they're translating when the ruler sins. But Medrash Rashi quotes the Medrash that says that it's one second, where am I? Yeah, that it comes from the word asher, comes from the word ashrei. We say ashrei yoshev v'yisacha. Ashrei means fortunate. And they say fortunate is the generation that their leader sins and he's looking for atonement. Meaning someone who's in a position of power, it's very hard to recognize that they did something wrong and that they need atonement. They say when the leader recognizes, I did something wrong, I need to bring an offering, they say fortunate is that generation. Okay, so what does he do in verse 23? If the sin that he committed becomes known to him, he shall bring his offering a male goat unblemished. And where am I? This one's different than the other ones. It's more like a regular offering. In verse 560, page 561, he shall lean his hands on the head of the goat. He shall slaughter it in the place he would slaughter the elevation offering before Hashem. It is a sin offering. The Kohen shall take from the blood of the sin offering with his forefinger, place it upon the horns of the elevation offering altar, which is where normal offerings where the blood was put. And he shall pour its remaining blood upon the base of the altar, and shall cause all its fats to go up and smoke on the altar like the fats of the peace offerings. Thus, the Kohen shall provide him atonement for sin and shall be forgiven. Okay, so now we're up to the regular sin offering of an individual. Verse 27 on page 561, if an individual person from among the people of the land shall sin unintentionally by committing one of the commandments of Hashem that may not be done, he becomes guilty. Like we said, this is person unintentionally does a sin that if they would be intentionally would be liable for kares or a death sentence. So if his sin that he committed becomes known to him, he shall bring his offering a she-goat, female goat unblemished. Again, he leans his hands. In verse 29, he shall lean his hands upon the head of the sin offering. He shall slaughter the sin offering in the place of the elevation offering. And there seems a theme that we're saying that the sin offerings were slaughtered in the same place as the elevation offering. And our sages say that is because a person might feel ashamed to be bringing a sin offering because people will look at them, oh, I wonder what he did, and it's embarrassing. It's like a public demonstration. I sinned, and it caused speculation. So sages say that it's broad that he would bring that offering in the same place as the elevation offering, so it's not clear what he's bringing it for. It's not like a public demonstration that he had sinned. And again, the Kohen would put blood on the base of the altar. And verse 31, he shall remove all its fat, as the fat had been removed from upon the peace offering. The Kohen shall cause it to go up and smoke on the altar as a satisfying aroma to Hashem. And the Kohen shall provide him atonement, and he shall be forgiven. Okay. So the next topic, and then we have if he shall bring a sheep for his sin offering. Again, it's a female sheep, and it's a similar process. Chapter 5, the bottom of page 561. If a person will sin if he accepted a demand for an oath and he is a witness, either he saw or he knew, if he does not testify, he shall bear his iniquity. This is a case that the court subpoenas a witness. The court believes that someone knows something about a court case, and they subpoena him. They summon him to testify, and he says he doesn't know anything about that. So the court could force him to swear an oath that he does not know any testimony. And if he swears an oath that he doesn't know anything about that, and then he admits that he had lied, he's sworn falsely. So, or if a person will have touched any contaminated object, if a person becomes ritually impure, and then he either eats from the offerings, from like the sacred, something that he wouldn't be allowed to eat in the state of spiritual ritual impurity, or if he enters the Mishkan, he enters the tabernacle or the temple in a state of ritual impurity. Or in another case, in verse 4, or if a person will swear expressing with his lips to do harm, to do good, anything that a person will express in an oath, but it was concealed from him, then he knew, and he became guilty regarding one of these matters. At page 563, if he swore an oath falsely, unintentionally, any regular oath, he swore an oath to something that, meaning not that he was subpoenaed in court to make the oath, but he swore an oath and it was false. So then he brings what's called an offering of an ola v'yored. That means higher and lower, and that there are levels of and depending on his means, what he would bring. So, and where am I here? So in verse 6, he shall bring his guilt offering in those cases to Hashem for a sin that he committed, a female from the flock, a sheep or a goat for the sin offering, and the Kohen shall provide atonement for a sin. So if he could afford it, he would bring a sheep or a goat. Verse 7, but if his means are insufficient for a sheep or a goat, then he shall bring his guilt offering for that which he had sinned, 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves. So he can't afford a sheep or a goat, he could bring these 2 birds. Then in verse 11, but if his means are insufficient for the 2 turtle doves, 2 young doves, then he shall bring a tenth of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He brings a meal offering. And so this is the higher or lower levels, depending on his means, for these sins, for these specific sins. Then in verse 14 on page 565, we have, and if Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, if a person commits treachery and sins unintentionally against Hashem holies, that means that if a person unintentionally derives benefit from something sacred, so meaning let's say something that's dedicated to the temple and they derive benefit from it. So he shall bring and it's unintentionally, he shall bring his guilt offering to Hashem an unblemished ram from the flock with the value of several shekels according to the sacred shekel for a guilt offering. For what he has deprived the sanctuary, shall make restitution and add a fifth to it. So what he took, he has to pay back plus 1/5 surcharge, and he brings this offering, a guilt offering. Then we have in verse 17 a case, if a person will sin, will commit one of the commands of Hashem, they may not be done, but he did not know and he became guilty. This is a case where he's unsure if he sinned or not. Meaning he knows that there was, let's say he ate something that may have been chaylev, may have been prohibited, or may have not been prohibited. He's not sure. It might have been truma, it might be, or it might not be. He's not. He may have committed a sin, but might not have been. There's a special guilt offering for that. And then on page 567, we have the regular guilt offering. That is, Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, if a person will sin and commit a treachery against Hashem by lying to his comrade regarding a pledge or a loan or a robbery, or by defrauding his comrade, like not paying him for his way, like withholding wages, or he found a lost item and denied it, and he swore falsely about any of all the things that a person can do and sin thereby. So let's say if he stole from someone, he stole from someone, or robbed someone would be right, really. He robbed someone and then swore falsely in court, and then admitted that he swore falsely about it, or like we said, that he had kept someone deposited something by him and he actually was negligent, but swore he wasn't negligent, something along those lines, and he swore to that effect, and then he admitted that he lied. In verse 24, he shall repay its principal and add a fifth to it. Again, he has to pay for it plus add 1/5 surcharge. He shall give it to his owner on the day he admits his guilt, and he shall bring his guilt offering to Hashem, an unblemished ram from the flock, the proper value as a guilt offering to the Kohen. And the Kohen shall provide him atonement before Hashem. It shall be forgiven for him for any of the things he might do to incur guilt. Hashem, shkoyach. Everyone have a great Shabbos.
Shkoyach.
To you. Okay, and next week, I'm assuming